Mochi Health is here to help you start your weight loss journey with caring, personalized support. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who truly listen and understand your unique needs. Eligible patients can access affordable GLP-1 medications delivered right to their door each month. No insurance? No problem. Mochi Health accepts FSA and HSA, making care accessible and affordable. And with 24/7 customer service, you'll never feel alone on your path to better health. Get started with Mochi Health today. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com with promo code AUDIO40.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my outlandish co-host, Brett.
Always try and keep you guessing, Alice.
And boy, do you keep me guessing. First of all, because everyone knows that you're a Renaissance man, but of course, this descriptor has nothing to do with you.
It never does.
It has to do with one of the most outlandish true crime stories I think I've ever heard, and recently has been the subject of a documentary that many of you may have seen called American Nightmare. And I didn't, by the way, the name, I don't know, was that apt? Like, it sounded very spooky, but it does not begin to capture the twists and turns of a story that seems too fantastical to believe. And indeed, a lot of people along the way didn't believe it.
Yeah, not a huge fan of the name either. I mean, I guess I understand what they were going for there, because there certainly were people going through a nightmare. But I agree with you that it doesn't quite capture the level of sheer craziness that happened throughout the documentary and throughout the events that are described in the documentary. And if you guys haven't seen it, it's well worth seeing. You know, I feel like there's a new true crime documentary every other day, it seems, which is great for those of us who like true crime, but they're not all good. You know, they don't all grab you. This was one, you guys may recall, we talked to Bob Mata a few weeks ago, and he mentioned it at the end. He's like, you need to go watch that. And I was like, okay, I'll check it out.
I think I watched it that night.
Yeah, did you watch that? I took a couple nights, but...
Well, so it's a three-parter, and as soon as we started watching it, I remember having read the book and heard the subjects speak in one of the crime cons, but I couldn't remember the facts because it's that outlandish. You know, one of those stories that are just so crazy. This is part of what we say about witnesses being coached, is like when your story has so many facets, it's actually really hard to remember it. So though I've like read the book, heard the story, I actually still couldn't remember the ins and outs and who was the good guy and the bad guy because it's so outlandish. It doesn't follow kind of the natural grooves your brain and synapses want to follow.
And let me just say, it's because we're really bad at this. If you haven't seen it, just stop listening. Stop listening. Go watch it. You can come back later and listen to us, because it really is worth experiencing without much knowledge going in, because there are several reasons for this. Number one, the documentary is manipulative, but I don't necessarily think it's manipulative in a bad way. I've thought about it a lot. There are 3 episodes, and the first episode is designed to make you feel a certain way. And I think what it's attempting to do is recreate the feelings of the Vallejo police, because we're going to be in Vallejo, California, when they first heard this story. And man, does it ever. By the end of the first episode, if you don't know the story, you will be absolutely convinced that people are lying to you, and they've been lying to you from the beginning. And it's really fascinating how the documentarians managed to do that. And I really believe it was a conscious choice to do it that way, so you would feel that way. And it's also a lesson in how documentaries manipulate you, whether it's for good or ill, and something to always remember when you watch them, because it's so easy just to believe everything you see when, in fact, oftentimes there's very much an agenda, and oftentimes a hidden agenda that you don't necessarily know that's going on.
Absolutely. So with that, Before we dive into kind of our thoughts on it, let's give kind of a quick background. Again, if you don't know the story, haven't seen the documentary, I really would go watch the 3-part documentary before hearing this, but we're going to give you kind of a snapshot of what happened in this case. There's not one, but 2 victims at least. So on March 23rd, 2015, Denise Huskins is kidnapped. Now, she's with her boyfriend, Aaron Quinn, at his house, and they suddenly wake to blinding light, and they are bound and blindfolded, and they're sedated, and there is just kind of chaos in the house. But the people who have broken into the house are talking to Denise and Aaron, and they say things like cooperate, they're speaking English, they're giving direction, they're not being threatening, they're not threatening to shoot anybody, they're just saying, we're going to take Denise. And Denise is gone in the dark of night, gone without a trace. And the next morning, Aaron is still in the house, and it isn't until about the afternoon that he calls the police. And the police hear Aaron's story, and they come and check out the house, and they decide that Aaron is involved in Denise's disappearance. This is the age-old story, right? Did you guys have a fight last night? You guys did have a tiff about your ex-girlfriend who used to live here, but no longer is here, and you all 3 work together. How interesting. And you're saying that your girlfriend, after you guys have had some sort of a tiff, lover spat, what have you, about your ex, is all of a sudden missing. And you can't explain how she's gone and why you waited to call for the police.
And look, you can imagine exactly why they would feel this way. The girlfriend, number one, I don't even think they'd been broken up that long. Number two, she might have been his fiancée. I can't remember exactly.
I think they were together for like a decade.
They were together for a really long time. And he clearly still had feelings for her and was very sort of open about the fact that he still had feelings for her. And they had this fight. And I just want to say, the police in this story get a lot of negativity. And a lot of it's deserved. But some of it is not, because the initial reaction, I have no problem with. We talked about this before. When you're engaged in policing, you have to play the odds to some extent. You can't just go chasing down rabbit trails all the time. You've got to think about the story that's being told to you, apply your training, your experience, everything you've seen, and decide, does this story make any sense? Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't investigate at all, and we're going to talk about some of the things they did later on that were problematic. But when the boyfriend tells you this crazy story, and if you watch the documentary, the very first thing they do is they play the 911 call over the opening credits. And the 911 operator is so incredulous about what she's hearing. Like, you can hear the doubt in her voice when he's telling her this story. And he's doing it very monotone, and I think some of that may be the sedation. But even from that point, like, they have already primed you to think this guy is lying. And I'll just go ahead and tell you, I found him to be, even telling this story years later on a documentary, I found him to be wholly unbelievable from the very beginning. And I don't know if it's just the way he presents or the way the documentary is edited or the story he was telling. I'm not sure what exactly it was.
There's like no, I think it's his affect, right? I mean, I heard him tell it in person and I felt the same way, which is like kind of a lack of urgency. I mean, the way that this kidnapping plays out, and the people that describe it are, you know, in the documentary, it would be the most horrific thing in the whole world for me to be taken in my sleep in the middle of the night. But somehow the way they tell it, it's almost like making excuses for their kidnappers. And it's like, well, they didn't break anything. They didn't really hurt me. They said, this isn't really for you, Denise. It's for the ex-girlfriend. All these like little details were just so not at the forefront of my mind if I am being stolen from my house. So maybe there's something about the way, the details in which he chooses to highlight that make him seem kind of unbelievable at the forefront.
One of the things that kept coming back to me is the JonBenet Ramsey story. And we've talked a lot about JonBenet Ramsey, but there's so many interesting parallels between that and this case. Like, I remember people, when they got the ransom letter and JonBenet Ramsey and they immediately called the police, people were like, but it said not to call the police. Why would you do that? And we were like, of course you'd call the police. That'd be the first thing you would do. Well, in this guy's case, he just sits around waiting on the phone call because he's like, well, they told me not to call and they said they'd be monitoring me. And I guess they installed a camera up in the corner of the room or something. Not sure how they did that. Don't know if they brought a ladder. Little unclear. There's all these weird details, like they were wearing wetsuits and they put goggles over their face. Just all this craziness, right?
There was like techno music or something.
Yeah, there was techno music playing.
It was like a dance party.
Exactly.
It was like a dance party kidnapping.
But everybody thought, if you read what people say about him, they're like, why would you wait? You would call the police immediately. And it's so funny how people's perspective, and this goes back to what we always say about judging people's behavior, people's perspective on how they judge somebody for what they do or don't do is completely different depending on who they want to be sympathetic towards. Because I felt the same way. Somebody breaks in my house and kidnaps somebody. As soon as they're gone, I'm calling the police. That's how I'm going to do it. But he didn't do that, and that was rational to him in that situation.
And I'm not being critical of his affect. I may have acted that way as well, but I'm trying to pinpoint why he seemed unbelievable. And I think part of that was the way the documentarians shot the storytelling. But also, I think in part of the way he tells the story and the way he tells it in the documentary, I think is the way he tells it to the police, because we have contemporaneous footage of the interrogation and how he tells the story. I don't think this is necessarily wrong. A lot of people have said, oh, this is privilege that, he's able to tell it this way. As unbelievable as this story is, and it's just objectively unbelievable, right? Rave party, strobe lights, wetsuits, right? And you're unharmed, and your girlfriend who's sleeping next to you is taken away with like no struggle, right? It's just an unbelievable story, whether you follow true crime or not. He tells the story to the police as if they will 100% believe it. I think that was part of the problem for him. I actually don't know there's a way for him to tell the story that would be more believable. So like the facts of the story, if you're going to be a kidnapper, I guess make the most absurd set of facts so that like the first people who hear it are inclined not to believe it. But he tells it in this very straightforward manner, and he doesn't try to qualify it in ways that we see witnesses do when they know they're telling you something that you're probably not going to believe, but they really want you to believe it. They're like, okay, this is going to sound crazy. This is going to sound really, really crazy, but this happened. He doesn't do any of that. He literally tells it straight, as if everyone's going to believe him. And he becomes so surprised when he realizes they don't believe him. Now, it stinks because the police should believe you, right? But in this case, it's almost like he doesn't catch on that they don't believe him until he's finished with the story multiple times.
And I would like to think that they're the police talking to him, and then they're the police actually investigating. Because you have the situation, you have this beautiful little community, Northern California. They show all these great shots of it in the documentary. It's on the beach. It looks amazing. Probably the kind of place that crazy things don't happen. And then you have this guy who is, he's calling the police, I guess the afternoon of the next day, saying, hey, last night, a couple guys dressed like Navy SEALs, I guess, broke into my house, kidnapped my girlfriend, did all this weird stuff, told me not to call. I decided, I probably should. And so now I'm calling you. I mean, there's a reason the police are not going to believe you. And I don't know what he could have done to make it better, but the police did a few things that I think are really strange. And I think they're strange no matter how much credit you want to give them. And one of the biggest things they did that I don't really understand is they put his phone on airplane mode. Now, he had said that the killers were going to call at some point. Putting the phone on airplane mode. Now I'll say this. It is, to a certain extent, standard operating procedure to put a phone in airplane mode when you seize it from someone for all sorts of like reasons that relate to searches and seizures and everything else. So it might have just been their standard policy to do it. But given the circumstances that he's saying, I'm expecting a call, number one, don't do that. See if they call. Number two, if you think this guy has just killed his girlfriend and dumped her somewhere, the first thing I would do is say, hey, can we examine your phone? He's probably going to say yes. If he says no, that gives you another clue that there's something wrong. You probably get a search warrant anyway, given what he's saying. You want to do that so you can track the phone. He may very well have taken it somewhere. So turning the phone off and like sticking it in a drawer somewhere while you interrogate him just doesn't seem like very good police work, no matter what you think happened. It's as if they relied entirely on their ability to get this guy to break and to say, no, my girlfriend wasn't kidnapped last night. After all, we really just had a fight. I killed her and dumped her in the ocean and came up with this cockamamie story to try and convince you.
Yeah, the putting the phone on airplane mode really makes no sense. At the very least, you could be looking at it, using it for leverage in the interrogation of a story that you find wholly unbelievable. But they don't use that tactic. And as we'll find out later, some missed calls happen and they never come through because his phone is on airplane mode. So around all of this, you can imagine that Aaron, as he's sitting in the police interrogation room, is getting more and more frantic because he's realizing no one's buying his story. But worse, that means no one's buying the fact that Denise is kidnapped by a third party that is not him, and they have her right now. And the last he heard, she was still alive. But every ticking minute where they're questioning him could be a minute that she is in harm's way, closer to death. He has no idea. And there's kind of no indication that people are going to buy his story, and he's not part of the solution here.
And let me just say, if whoever took Denise had murdered her and dumped her in the ocean, I'm not exactly sure what would have happened in this story. I don't know that they ever could have actually arrested him based on what they had, because they didn't really have much of anything other than his crazy story. But he absolutely would have been their number one and only suspect for murder. Now, maybe eventually they would have gotten around to doing some investigating that would lead them somewhere else, but they were 100%. They were giving him a polygraph. He was failing. He didn't actually fail. It was just inconclusive because it's a polygraph. So of course it's inconclusive. Though if there was ever anybody who's going to pass a polygraph, it was this guy, because he had like zero emotion. I can't believe he didn't pass it. He was just like straight as an arrow. But anyway, like, they are entirely focused on him. They're bringing in the FBI. The FBI guys are trying to crack him. Everybody's going at him. And for 2 days, they think this man has murdered his girlfriend, and we're going to find her. We're going to find something, and we're going to crack this case. But that is not what happens.
No. So they don't find her right away. It's not until 2 days later, on March 25th, 2015, 400 miles away from where she was taken, Denise is released in Huntington Beach, which is where her parents live. It's her childhood home. And police declare this kidnapping to be an orchestrated event, not just by Aaron, but also by Denise, and that this was not a kidnapping at all, using the term Gone Girl, that somehow she has concocted this entire thing to draw attention to herself. Somehow this, and you can see how this may seem unbelievable, this is like a door-to-door kidnapping service that travels 400 miles, picks you up from one place and decides to release you 48 hours later, seemingly unharmed. You have all your limbs, you're still able to walking down the street to go to your childhood home, where you get to go home with not really a scratch on your body. And with this, without really any more investigation, the Vallejo police come out with a very strong statement about what they think happened and what they think should happen going forward. And they said, Mr. Quinn and Ms. Huskins have plundered valuable resources away from our community and taken the focus away from the true victims of our community, while instilling fear among our community members. Vallejo police spokesperson Lieutenant Kenny Park said this during a press conference. And he continued, so, if anything, it is Mr. Quinn and Ms. Huskins that owe this community an apology. And essentially, Denise and Aaron have to go into hiding because they are the subject of massive media attacks, social media attacks, calling them really ugly names, telling them they should die, that they wanted attention, and they deserve all the bad things in life that should come to them.
And I just want to pause for a moment to think about what happened in this scenario. So, look, I think we're trying to be as charitable as we can be to the police, particularly in the beginning, when honestly, I think if you say you would have heard his story and believed him, I don't believe you. I think if you had heard his story that first day, you would have had some serious doubts about his credibility. Doesn't mean you would have acted the way they acted. Maybe you would have pursued different investigative steps. That's all fine, but you wouldn't have believed him. Nobody would have. But then when she shows up, now look, the video of her is strange. She's just strolling down the road to her parents' house. She's got a bag. because apparently this kidnapper allowed her to pack before she left on her kidnapping journey in the trunk of the car. You know, there are several things about it. Number one, the effect of the drugs that both of them were given. Now, Alice says that he's always like that. Maybe he is. I didn't see him. I missed him at CrimeCon that year, so I did not see their talk. But she obviously is under drugs as well. And then there's the effect of trauma. And I think it is always good when we listen to these cases, and we talk about this all the time, to just give people a little bit of the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise about their behavior, at least in the immediate aftermath of these kind of things happening. Because I think in the immediate aftermath of someone disappearing or being kidnapped or sexually assaulted, which we're going to talk about, that happened in this case as well, how you react may not be the way other people would or the way other people think you should have. Not everybody's a crier. Not everybody's a screamer. A lot of people are remarkably calm in really bad situations, which is a good thing when you want to lean on them, but maybe not a good thing when you're trying to decide whether or not they just committed a crime or had a crime committed to them. But regardless of that, whatever you thought when you saw the video, look, there are situations where the police have a strong feeling about what's going on. The Vallejo police, obviously at that point, had a strong feeling that this was a hoax. You do not go out 12 hours later and say that to the media based on nothing more than the way you perceive these people. Like, go out and say, we're going to work this case. We're going to get to the bottom of it. We'll let you know as soon as we do. And then figure out what happened. And if it was them, hammer them, charge them, everything else. But the way they handled it was it was a remarkable display of incompetence as far as how to handle a situation where you don't know all the facts.
Absolutely. And, you know, as soon as Denise kind of reappears, the police want to talk to her. And of course, she wants to talk to the police too. Something horrible has happened to her over the last 48 hours. And she begins to tell the police her story, which is very similar in how it starts to what Aaron said, that there were flashing lights. She woke up in bed. She was bound. She was blindfolded and she was drugged. And she remembered someone saying, this isn't for you, but you'll do. And they take her away in the trunk of a car. In the trunk of Aaron's car, I believe. And they leave in the middle of the night. And there's a lot more to this. You should listen, you know, the second episode of American Nightmare, where it's from her point of view. But she explains how she is held hostage in a room. And it's a very strange hostage situation, though, because her kidnapper kind of wants to be her friend in a way. He tells her that, sorry, he has to do this. He's really a nice guy. He doesn't really want to do this, but his associates, and he mentions associates, people he works with, that they are some former military, you know, secret operations.
It's a small foreign faction.
A small foreign faction. Those of you who don't catch on, that is a callback to JonBenet Ramsey. He says that this is what they do. This is their job. They kidnap people for ransom, and he never hurts them. It's just 48 hours. If they get the money, she's released. No big deal. And really, this is a friendly situation. He's just a nice guy. He's just doing a job. This is his business. And she even says that, you know, he plays this like French pop music during the day, and she doesn't hate it. Like, it is what it is. I mean, she is captive, but she's not bound. I think she's just in the room blindfolded until things kind of take a dark turn. And that is when she says this kidnapper comes in her room, and she never sees his face because she's blindfolded every time he comes in. And he says, we have a problem. They've lost contact with Aaron. Now, if you remember, the police had put Aaron's phone on airplane mode, and he had been getting calls from them up until this point. And he says, we realize, which is kind of a strange thing to realize only now, but we realize that we have nothing to keep you from talking. And so we need collateral against you. And due to that, he says that he needs to have sex with her on tape. So some sort of porn revenge collateral. And by the way, even though that's described in kind of a nice way, let's not pretend that about what it's not. It's absolutely rape. And that's what he does. He rapes her. And she, and he videotapes it as far as she can tell. And that's it for the day. So already things are changing. At first it was, this kidnapping's not for you. And then it was, you're not going to be hurt. This is our business. We're a professional organization. We're going to release you in 48 hours. And now she was just raped on camera and she can do nothing about it. But that's not the only time it happens. She says that associates or some people come over and there's some tense talking. And he comes in the next day and says, yesterday's tape wasn't good enough because it wasn't believable. You have to look like you want to have sex with me. And I mean, I don't know anything that is more demeaning, really. You're going to rape me and then tell me I have to act like I am enjoying this. And so he rapes her a second time, also on video. And she explains to the police, what was I supposed to do? I had no weapons. I am drugged. I am blindfolded. I'm held hostage in a room. Of course I have to go along with it. If I fight back, like, no one's going to win. He says he's not going to hurt me, but he also said he wasn't going to touch me. And here we have 2 instances within 48 hours where it's a complete about-face.
And the police have a problem with the fact that she didn't fight back, she didn't scream, and she's explaining all the reasons that didn't happen. It reflects incredibly poorly on the Vallejo police. I don't know how much of it is accurate. Like I said, I always take everything in the documentary with a grain of salt because you just never know how it's edited, but they look awful. Pretty much from beginning to end, and they only get worse. At the same time, another strange thing that's happening is the kidnappers decide they need a proof of life thing. So they have her record a statement basically saying that she's been kidnapped, she's alive, she cites to some event that happened, I think a plane crash, and they send this to a reporter. And it's another one of those strange things where she sounds very calm and matter of fact in the tape. But once again, she is both deeply traumatized and being drugged the whole time while she's making this proof of life statement. At this point, once she makes a proof of life statement, the police, they're pretty clear that Aaron obviously didn't kill her, but they still have a lot of doubts about him. And she is going to return, as we said, about a day later. Essentially, I don't know, this person who's doing this is someone who's deeply disturbed. And I think trying to figure out what's going on in their mind is probably a fool's errand. But at some point, he decides he's going to release her. He shows her a video of her father talking to reporters when he arrived in Vallejo. And he says, basically, I'm going to take you home. And rather than drop her off in Vallejo, he says, look, there's too many reporters, there's too many people. I'm just going to take you home. So she says, he basically drops her off, tells her, not to look. He's going to drive away. He drives away. And she realizes, oh, my goodness, this is the street I live on. And so she then walks back to her house. And that's when this nightmare begins. He had told her not to tell the police about sexual assault. So her initial statement to them, she does not mention that. But very shortly thereafter, she hires an attorney because it becomes evident to her that the police don't believe her and that they're taking a very aggressive posture on this. And really, it's when she hires the attorney that the police decide, well, we're just going to go out and say you made all this up. And at that point, it becomes a thing where the Vallejo PD and the FBI, who also looks horrible in all this, rather than actually investigate what happened and try to determine, once again, if they made this up, there should be proof. Things like their cell phone and their cell phone records. They don't pursue any of those avenues. They pursue entirely a pressure on them, media pressure on them, get them to admit they made this up. That is their perspective. And that is what they do for months. And these two people are absolutely crucified in the press. The press has decided this is live Gone Girl. They lied about all this. They're terrible people. They're getting death threats. Their friends won't talk to them anymore. They basically have no life. It's this is where the name American Nightmare comes in, I think. It is a nightmare, particularly in our modern world where everything is so public. But then, June 5th, 2015. So first, the police, or actually the same reporter who got the proof of life video, starts getting texts and emails and photographs from the supposed kidnappers who say, this is unfair. She didn't lie about this. Here's a picture of the gun. Here's a picture of the strobe light. Just sending all this stuff that they supposedly used as part of the kidnapping. And then tells the reporter, since they don't believe her, I'm going to have to do it again. So then on June 5th, 2015, a very similar incident occurs in Dublin, California, where someone breaks in to a house. Fortunately, the woman's parents were there. They're able to fight him off. And the police there.
Can we just talk about how bold that is, by the way? Like, he breaks in the first time, knowing that Aaron's going to be there, which is like a high level of difficulty for any sort of kidnapper to take away only one of the two, especially when it's a lover situation. You would think someone wants to fight for them. And in the second situation, we'll talk more about how he knew about his victims. He also knew that his victim was not living alone. It's a child. I don't think like a young child, but a child nonetheless, who's living at home with her parents. And her parents are in the house and physically fight him off.
So the Dublin PD show up. I think was it his phone? He'd left his phone? Like he dropped something. It was his phone.
And the daughter pointed to it.
That's right.
And said he left his phone.
So once again.
Way to go, girl,
yeah.
By the way.
So
like to have your wits about you after you just almost got kidnapped.
Exactly. So the Dublin PD, they're like, well, let's not even look at this phone. The phone's probably relevant. No. They, unlike the Vallejo PD, are like, hey, phone, treasure trove of information. And they're able to track this individual, Matthew Muller, to a cabin some distance away. And in particular, I want to give credit to one of the officers, Misty Caruso, who becomes the hero of the story. So not all the police are bad in this story. And they track...
And this is her first detective case. She became a detective, and I think this is the first case she investigated. And she describes in the documentary that she actually became a detective specifically because she had a girlfriend who had been sexually assaulted. And she wanted to kind of be there for women who had been through sexual assault, rapes, and investigate these cases and make women feel safe again.
So they find this guy, Matthew Muller, at this cabin, and she continues to investigate. They find all sort of weird stuff that leads her to believe this was not his first time to do something like this. They find a pair of goggles, blacked out goggles, and they find a hair in the goggles, a blonde hair. And the victim, the person he tried to take, wasn't blonde. So she knew this was more than this. And she starts looking into it. And she's trying to figure out exactly what happened. And she's running down leads. And eventually she stumbles upon this whole Gone Girl story in Vallejo. And she sees a picture and realizes this could be it. Blonde hair, this could be it. Story is exactly like what we're looking at. I have the goggles. And in just the craziest, I mean, there's a lot of crazy in this story. She calls the Vallejo police and nobody answers and they don't return her calls. And she calls
for like days.
Yeah, for like a week. And nobody ever returns her call.
I understand when I call the police, they don't, like as a layperson, they don't answer my call, but like a fellow police department, nothing.
Yeah, the whole thing's crazy. And eventually she gets through to them and they're like, oh, well, the FBI's handling this one because they had turned it over to the FBI at this point. And when she's able to finally get in touch with the FBI, I mean, you can imagine the like, moments that ran through everybody who've been trying to build a case against these two for this whole time. And then all of a sudden, their story just starts to fall into place. And they finally will look at Aaron's cell phone and notice those calls they missed. And they trace them. And where do they trace back to? The same cabin.
The lake house.
The lake
house.
Lake house.
They could have found her. I mean, the calls were coming in. How stupid, by the way. We can't miss the fact that Matthew Muller, who it was traced back to, was a Marine, in fact. So that part that he said he was, ex-military was true. And he went to Harvard Law School, Brett.
And in fact, he was at Harvard when I was there. He graduated in 2006. But then he was a researcher for another 3 years. Yeah, teaching assistant. So I'm sure I ran into him at some point. I don't remember him. He looks kind of familiar, but Harvard's a really big place, so I think I just missed him, which is not the worst thing. But, it's scary to think this lunatic was living there while I was there. Probably didn't have any interest in me, but, I mean, you think about your friends, right? Like, but he was there, And then at some point, and the weird thing about it, well, there's a lot of weird things about it, but he graduates from Harvard. He's a teaching assistant for 3 years. Then he goes back to California and he's doing like immigration work, which most of the people who do that, it's the Lord's work for them. I knew people who did that, who graduated from Harvard and then went and did immigration work. But I thought it was interesting that he was doing that because he didn't really seem like the Lord's work kind of guy, you know? So I don't know what all was going with him. I think there's probably a lot more to him.
And he got disbarred, though.
And he eventually got disbarred. It sounds like basically he was going to be the Golden State Killer too. Like if you follow his progression, he starts off as like kind of a peeping Tom, kind of, you know, breaking into houses type thing. He escalates to breaking into people's houses. And I'm going to say attempting to rape them, though it's like he doesn't follow through on it because it isn't fitting with whatever his fantasy is. I think there were 2 different women on the documentary who talked about he broke into their house, and then one of them told him she had been raped before. And he said, well, I don't want to traumatize you again. A little too late for that, buddy. And leaves. And the other one basically was like, begged him not to. And at some point he was like, I can't do this.
And he acceded.
Yeah.
Which, man, I guess begging works sometimes.
Well, I think it depends on the fantasy the person's trying to, because some people, I think if you're there on a power trip, that probably is the worst thing you can do, right? Because that just accentuates the power trip. But I think for him, he wanted to be a nice guy. Yeah.
He wanted to be this, he wanted to be, I think, what he said he was, right? Ex-Marine, like this. He wasn't just kidnapping for the sake of kidnapping. He was on this greater purpose, and he was the best of the kidnappers. Because that's the crazy thing is when, the whole reason behind the rapes was so that she wouldn't talk to the police or she wouldn't tell them things. And then when the police don't believe her, he starts sending pictures and evidence to the journalist basically to say, wait, no, I did it. Hey, look over here. He wants the credit and he wants to be a nice guy because I don't think, and I think this is right about the progression of the Golden State Killer. He never sees himself as this rapist, as a kidnapper, as a future murderer. He sees himself as a nice guy who's doing what he has to do. And you're just not fitting into my mold. What are you doing, girls? Don't close your blinds. I'm just here to have a little nighttime show. He literally peeps on these girls in this neighborhood for weeks and months at a time. And they talk about how the police don't believe them. And so they take matters into their own hands and basically chase him off themselves one night because they know he's never going to stop. And had they not done that, he probably would have continued and maybe escalated because his fantasies weren't going to stay hands off. We see that with Denise. He clearly crossed the line into being a rapist.
And that's the other thing that you learn at the end of the documentary is he was doing all this basically in the neighborhood where Denise lived. The people in the neighborhood essentially figured out who he was, and the police just didn't care at all. So they took no steps to stop this guy in this just progressive, extreme thing he's turning into with this fantasy where he wanted to rape her, but he had to set it up for his own pleasure, I guess, that somehow they're almost in it together. Like, I have to do this thing to you, because of what my mean associates are saying.
So with that, Brett, a big question of all of this is whether there were more people than just him, because he's the only one who's been arrested. Luckily, thank you to the, amazing detective Misty Caruso, he has been convicted. He is sentenced to 40 years in prison, and there is justice for Denise. Now, all the other people he's peeped on, the women he's broken into and traumatized, didn't end up raping, thank goodness. He has not been convicted for those, but at least there is justice for her. But a big question continues, remains, and that is, did he have associates? Was he part of this, Marine whatever? I have thoughts on this. I'm curious if you do, Brett. But a lot of people at the end of this documentary were like, what about all the other associates? We have this underground Marine, Navy SEAL, kidnapper organization, and no one is getting them because he's only the tip of the iceberg.
So I hate to say anything definitively in this case, but no, I don't think there were any associates. I think all that was faked somehow or put on. The only real evidence you have is that he referred to there being multiple people. Somebody showed up at the cabin. Maybe Denise heard people arguing in the other room is what she said. I can think of various ways you could fake that. I don't think there's any way that there are multiple involved in this, though. Given all the twists and turns, I guess that would be the next logical step. But no, I don't think there's. I think this is uniquely his fantasy, and he was engaged in it.
I think that's exactly right. Even that was my initial question, was what about all the other people? But then when I backed up and kind of looked at the way his psychological profile and the way he did everything and the way they were able to search his cabin, I think that he in his mind was part of something bigger, which made him not just a kidnapper, a rapist, a eventual murderer, by being part of this associate group. It may have been that he'd read about it. It was some spy novel or something like that, but he put himself in the category or the league of maybe these Robin Hood type of Justice League people, but they weren't real. And I do think that by kind of blaming it on someone else, like my associates are mad that the video wasn't persuasive enough, that he was creating that scenario so that she, Denise, still thought of him as a good guy. And that could have been anyone. It could have been his neighbor being like, hey, this is like South Lake Tahoe. This is a really nice cabin, and you have disgusting stuff all over your cabin. You're living like filth. It could have been that. It could have been his mom. This is his mother's cabin, by the way, because he's jobless and, is, I think, from a well-to-do family, but he himself doesn't really have much. It could have been his mother or his father coming by and basically say, like, what are you doing in the middle of the day? You're still hanging out here? When are you going to get a job? It could have been as simple as that. And, that conversation, what Denise says she overheard, remember, she was drugged during this time. If she said it sounded heated, it could have been heated. It could have been something else. And he used that as, it could have been heated because he didn't want the person to come in the house because he had someone hidden away in the house. But the fact that there's no indication of another person around her, that they had his phone and they don't trace it to anyone else, I don't think there's another person. And I say that because, who knows, like you said, if new evidence comes in, absolutely follow that lead. But I do think they would have been able to track his movements and his cell phone habits to associates because he was not good at cell phone hygiene.
Yeah, I think once they had him and had all the evidence, they would have been able to figure it out if there were other people. And it's just not that hard to fake voices. I mean, it could have been as simple as, like you said, some random person coming by, or just he's got a tape recorder and he recorded himself in a different voice yelling, and then it's just she hears muffled voices and thinks there's multiple people. No, I don't.
And he gets to be the hero.
Right.
Remember, like in all these other scenarios of women describing likely who was him breaking into their apartments, he like bargains. He wants to be the nice guy. And that goes to the other thing is, one thing that really stands out in this story is at the time of the kidnapping, he said, oh, this was not meant for you. You're the wrong person here, right? And a lot of people are like, why? How did he know? Look, we know that he was a peeping Tom for months, if not years at a time. And when you're a peeping Tom, you get to know the people who you peep against. And we know that Aaron's ex had lived there up until I think the month before, something like that, very recently. He probably had peeped on her along with all the other women who had reported him peeping on them for the past several months. And that's who he thought he was going in. He didn't really care if it was Denise or the ex. He just wanted to kidnap a woman and rape her, right? And that's why he said, well, you'll do, because he wasn't really doing it for the money. He really was doing it for the kidnapping aspect of it. So those of you who think that he did this for money or for power, no, he did this to rape her. That's kind of what was escalating in his types of crimes. And so that's why it didn't matter that it wasn't the ex. It just happened that he likes to know something about his victims. It might not even be that he likes to know it. He just does know it because he's a peeping Tom. And then he builds up the courage to break into their house. And he knows stuff about them and can call them by their first name, which is why I think he's so bold. He knows that if he was going in for the ex, this is Aaron's house. It's not her house, right? When he goes into that girl's house, he's been peeping on her. He knows that she doesn't live alone. She lives with a mother and a father. So, I mean, he, with his boldness and his psychological profile of himself, that he's a good guy, I think there was no stopping him. And he was going to do this again, and he was going to get bolder, and he was going to kill. And thank goodness he hadn't had the opportunity to kill yet.
No, I agree 100%. And I think you're right. I think this is rare, so I don't ever like to scare you guys. But there are circumstances where he's a hunter He was hunting this area. I think he knew everything about pretty much everybody who lived in this area. And I think he had targeted Erin's fiance, and she was going to be the one. And then things got wonky on him, but he went ahead and went through with it anyway. And I think he had been stalking them for quite some time. It reminds me in some ways of how I think the Idaho murders went down. I think that was another case where you had somebody who had picked some people that he decided he was going to kill, and he stalked those people for a long time and followed them and watched them for a long time. And I think that was a similar situation here. Like I said, I don't think that happens that often, but it does happen, and you see it happen. And I think that he gathered a lot of intelligence. I mean, he was a Marine, right? So he scoped out the area, he gathered intelligence, he made a plan, and he executed it. And it was complex. And it was complex both because his mind was so messed up that he built this complex, like you said, weird savior thing where it's almost like there are movies. He told
one of his victims who he didn't rape how to reinforce her house so as not to be the victim of another break-in.
Right.
Like, that's a weird savior complex.
Like, there are movies where the guy kidnaps somebody and then they become friends, and by the end he's trying to save her and all this other stuff. I mean, if things hadn't gone sideways, who knows what the full plan was that he was going to do by the end. Maybe he thought she would fall in love with him by the end, but the media pressure got too great and they weren't believing Erin, and he decided to let her go. The sort of depths of his depravity are hard to say, but yeah, I think that's pretty much what happened. And it's a fascinating documentary, and you should watch it. And there are people who watch the whole documentary and still don't believe them, which I thought was interesting.
I will say this much. It's easy to watch the documentary and just be like angry at the Vallejo PD, the FBI. There was one kind of line dropped that the FBI agent had formerly dated the ex-girlfriend. If that's true, he should not have investigated the case. I just don't know. I don't have the case file. Did he go on one date when they were back 15 years old? Maybe that's something that can be waived. That's not a bias. But if they ever actually dated, no, he probably should not have investigated it. But I have nothing to go off of other than the one line in the documentary. So basically, it's really easy to just scream and be angry at the police. But I think it's important to kind of zoom out and see where the police went wrong. Because honestly, the story that Erin told at first, I can understand why he was a suspect, right? And likely he needed to be a suspect at first. I think where they really messed up, royally messed up, is when she was released and she told her story, and the very next response was to call them fraudsters in a press release. To have that press release before really any due diligence had been done. Look, worst case scenario, you do a little investigation and you figure out that she's a liar, that she's a real live Gone Girl. It doesn't take that long to figure it out. But if you're wrong, you have a girl who says that she's been raped twice, kidnapped from her own bed. And those are, the stakes are really, really high there for you to just decide she's a liar without doing any investigation. They did very poor investigative work at that point. Up until then, I honestly kind of understand their investigative reasons. I don't think it's good police work, but you can explain it. When she comes back and they have that press conference, that was just bad police work.
And the opposite of this is the Hoover police and how they handled the Carlee Russell case. You guys may recall this. Carlee Russell, she calls the police, says she sees a toddler on the side of the road, stops to get the toddler. There's a scream. The phone cuts out. I just got to tell you, everybody in law enforcement knew that was a lie. Knew it didn't happen from the very beginning. Absolutely knew it. I knew it. Everybody on Facebook, when the gallery was losing their minds, I was like, I'm just not going to say anything because this is going to work itself out. But the Hoover police, even though they knew that didn't happen, they investigated the case. They took it seriously. When she showed up, they did not immediately go out and say she's lying. They continued their investigation. They found the evidence that she was lying, and eventually she confessed to what she had done. That is the way to handle it, because if you're wrong, if this is the 1 in a million chance, and she really was kidnapped in this insane way, well, then you've investigated it and maybe you can find her. And when you decide she did it, you have the evidence to back it up. It's not just you going out there and saying this is all a lie and having a lot of pushback. By the time they came out and said she lied, they had the whole case lined up. They had it locked down. There was no option for her other than to admit, yeah, I lied for reasons that we still don't really fully understand, but that's how you handle a case like that. You take it seriously, you do good police work, you follow up your leads, and then when it all shakes out, you're not making a documentary about you and how you jump to conclusions and just completely screwed the pooch in a major case.
Well, I mean, this one, it was great storytelling in the documentary. It was infuriating, and it's a just incredible story. I'm really glad he's caught because, like I said, I think he absolutely would have escalated. 40 years is not long enough, but at least, you know, he was caught and he was convicted and he's sentenced, thank goodness. You know, being a Marine, going to Harvard, drives a man to weird places.
Apparently. I'm going to blame Harvard for it.
I'm just kidding. He was obviously like that before he ever went to Harvard or the Marines, and he was clearly a smart person.
It's wild that he could make it that far. That he could...
It's not to me. Do you not remember the people you went to school with?
They weren't...
Like, half of them, I'm like, you could use
there were plenty
your
of
smarts for evil.
psychopaths at Harvard.
Exactly.
But he's not a psychopath.
Exactly.
He's like... He's got something much more fundamentally wrong with him than that.
Oh, something is fundamentally wrong, but he's a psychopath.
I don't know.
You know what? Actually, I think it all had to do with him being a Marine and going to Harvard. He had this clearly elevated sense of self, and he had the savior complex.
Well, now that's true.
And he had external factors that were validating that feeling, right? And that was creating this narcissistic whatever aura around him, because look, I really am as good as I think I am. I got into Harvard Law School. You know, I'm not just at Harvard Law School. Yeah, I don't want to go into the real world. I'm going to stay around campus because, by the way, a campus is a great place to continue to feel like you're in the halls of, you know, Hogwarts and that you're so smart. Every time I go back to campus, I feel like I'm back in a bubble of I'm so smart and I don't have to go out to the real world. I think being there for 6 years, 3 years of law school and then 3 years of being a teaching assistant, is a false ivory tower that built this aura around himself where he could believe that he really was this savior. He was really a good guy and he knew more than the rest of the world. And so he got to do whatever he wanted. I think that all kind of built into who he was becoming.
Yeah. I mean, you could write several books on this guy. So, and there is a book if you guys want to check it out. Aaron and Denise, they wrote a book. I think they're touring it around now. I'm sure it's pretty good. I haven't read it, but it's a fascinating story. You should check it out. They did get $2.5 million from the Vallejo police for defamation, which was a bargain for the police, frankly. But check out American Nightmare. Check out their book. I think you'll probably enjoy it. Alice, I think we're going to forego questions for tonight because Alice is still very sick. She's barely making it. She made it through for you guys, though.
I am making it.
You're making it. You're definitely making it.
Okay, all my friends at Yale who I just threw shade at, please don't come murder me. Anyways, all I'm saying is those smarts can be used for good or evil. But if you guys have thoughts on this or have watched it and want to vent about it, we'd love to hear about it. You can reach us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. Reach us on social media at prosecutorspod at X, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We are now on TikTok. I am scared. I don't know what exactly that means. We post videos to them. I don't really know who watches them, but they're there. So if you want a good laugh, go over and watch our videos. Well, Brett, is there anything you'd like to add before we sign off for the day?
No, thanks for making it through, Alice. You guys, Alice is very sick, but she wanted to do this. I told her we didn't have to. She was like, no, we will record. So here we are.
I did say that. Well, thank you guys for putting up with my congestion, but it's really good to be with you guys and with you, Brett. And until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. And the doctor was like, yeah, you just have like a low-grade fever. You'll probably have them for 2 weeks. And I was like, is that normal? And she was like, the flu is really bad. I was like, oh, okay.
Like,
She's like, I don't know what to tell you. I could put you on antibiotics, but I wouldn't if I were you. I could give you steroids, I wouldn't if I were you. I did say that. Well, thank you guys for putting up with my congestion, but it's really good to be with you guys and with you, Brett. And until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutors Podcast, Legal Briefs.
No, it's not.
Nope, one more time.